So this is sort of around the back, everybody. This area is just whippersnipped because it was a building site and there's rocks and lots of things in there which I don't want to put my mower in. And then just over the back here is the same. This is all whippersnipped as well, so it's quite a big area. And then I call this the horse paddock. And then beyond the fence to the road's all done. Looks pretty good, considering I haven't done it for, oh gee, be easy 6 weeks. Over the back there, that's all sprayed. There's marshmallow weeds and all sorts in there. All this area here is leaf blown and pushed out the back there. This looks heaps better than what it was down in the car park. So everything's been blown. I gave it another little go anyway too, but a lot of this stuff here is still very damp and wet, but it's all pushed into those back holding little paddocks. So I didn't get to get in and give them a going over with the mower. There's a little bit under the car, but you can't do much about that. And then you saw me go over this little area, I don't know, was it 5 or 6 times? And you can still see the leaves, but they'll work their way in. They'll be fine. It was quite thick, but the mower did a good job. The two main areas were here out the front. As you saw, I took particular attention here, going at right angles and really working those leaves in. And they came up really well. This one's the VIP bit for me because it's in the front of the office, so it has to be good. So very happy with it. Edges, you see the cliff edge there, all done nice and neat. Around the electricity, everything's leaf blown off. And it needed to be. There were leaves and stuff everywhere. Didn't get everything obviously, but they will work their way back in. The poplar's still got a lot to come. So, and then this area up here, it's rough, and when it's just, you know, and there's roots and rocks, and so I just worked it in pretty sort of roughly. And then walking around, there's the patrol again. So we've done and there's that area that I said initially that I whippersnip down to the clothesline, where I was avoiding, and if you had smell-o-vision you'd know this, but there's a dead fox there. So I'm not picking him up. I don't want to gag. He's pretty rank. And then just up the back here as well, just, you know, gave it a quick run over. So pretty much that's it for the day. So that was it. That's it for the day, everybody. That took a bit over 4 hours to do. So a bit of, well, I'd imagine I didn't time it, but well, I did, but I just don't have that handy driving. But roughly the same for each bit. So you know, the whippersnipping, so it might have been an hour 20 or thereabouts or something for each. So pretty happy with that. The mulching in of the leaves, I'm very happy with. They do work in well, and it's best to do them like, as I think I started at 11:30, finished around 3:30ish. So, but that allows the sun to do its bit and to help dry things out a little bit. So that's why I sort of got in and leaf blowed them first, just to stir them up a bit and get the air amongst them. Then whippersnip and then mowed, and then did the leaf blow cleanup a little bit, well, at the end. So just for anyone who want to know, I wasn't using mulching blades. I was just using normal high lift blades, and they do mulch it up pretty well. But the other part of that is, instead of, you might do 2 or 3 runs over with the mulching blades, I think I might have done 5 or 6, but they were quite thick, and if I wasn't crook with COVID, I would have been here when they were really dry, and more than likely I sort of would have got 2 mows in, so that I could have worked them in, as, let's call it, half them might have dropped, and then the other half, and you just work them in. But they'll work back into the ground over the winter and into the spring, and the soil will be better for it. I could have raked those excess leaves in that smaller bit where those trees were, but I'm just being a bit careful. As I said, I've had COVID, and I would rather the machine or the mower do the job, and it mightn't look as pristine as a lawn that's done with either a catcher or you rake them up and then do it. But it's still come up pretty good, and both those front sections that are on the main road, they came up really nice, so I was very happy with those. So so there's just bits and pieces going on now. You would have seen my post where we had a minus 3.5 Celsius, which I don't know, is that 21 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. So it's getting cold now. Pretty much we've had 3 or 4 frosts in a row, so nothing's growing. It's tidying up stuff, catching up on those customers that I wasn't able to do for this past month, being ill, and but that'll keep me busy for a little while, and I'll just poke along and if I can try and do as many more when the sun's out and it's a little bit warmer, and that'll be the way to do it. But anyway, that's it for today. Not much else going on, being a Sunday, so it'll be the rest of a quiet afternoon, and we'll just look forward to the next week. I hope everyone's well. Thank you to all my subscribers and viewers, and I'll thank my customers again for sticking with me. I do appreciate it very much, and I'll catch you soon.